So I have a lot of editing to do this month. So let's talk about editing. Hello there, my name is Colin and welcome back to the Filmmaker Files. The past couple episodes we've done a little bit more on set, behind the scenes, more on the technical side of how to do things. And while I think that's great and I want to continue to do those, I know that there are definitely other YouTube channels out there that have covered a lot of that kind of stuff before. And while I want to continue to do that kind of stuff, one of the biggest things that I've been looking forward to doing with the Filmmaker Files is diving into some of the more abstract ideas, looking at how your framing, lighting, and music and editing can have an emotional impact on an audience. So in order to take a look at the different principles of editing, we gotta talk about my main man, Vsevolod Pudovkin. Not talked about a lot necessarily unless you actually go to a film school or do some research, but I think he's incredibly interesting and he definitely had a huge influence when it comes to editing. Pudovkin was a Russian filmmaker in the early 20th century. He was a director and an actor, and he even wrote a book called Film Technique and Film Acting. But like I said earlier, one of the biggest fields that he had an impact in was editing. Pudovkin has a great quote, which is, "The foundation of film art is editing." Now, Pudovkin was pretty ahead of his time, noting that the way that you lay out your shots next to each other in the editing process can have a really big emotional impact on your audience. It wasn't about just taking you from one place to the next, to the next, to the next to progress the story, which he called structural editing. But the editing process was also about directing the emotions of your audience, which he called relational editing. So from that, he got his 5 principles of editing: contrast, parallelism, symbolism, simultaneity, and leitmotif. Now, there are plenty of essays that you can check out there that list off famous examples of each one of these principles, and I'm going to be mentioning them myself. But I also just want to take a movie. I'm going to take the film Interstellar and just show you how you can look for each one of these things in any film you watch. So let's start off with contrast. Contrast is pretty straightforward. It's taking 2 different things, putting them next to each other, and really highlighting the differences between them. This can be done with a cut, or it can be done with a montage. A couple famous examples of this would be the baptism scene at the end of The Godfather. When Michael Corleone is getting baptized and he's renouncing Satan, he is also having his men carry out hits on a bunch of people all around the city. Another famous example would be in 2001: Space Odyssey, when the ape throws the bone up into the air and it cuts to a spaceship, although in a minute we're going to argue how that could also be parallelism, but it shows a pretty big contrast in terms of technology with the ape and the technology of mankind in the future. Now we'll take a look at Interstellar. In the opening scene of the film, Cooper is having a nightmare about one of his test flights going wrong and spinning out of control. Then we cut to him in the safety of his own bed down on Earth. Next up is parallelism, which is really just the opposite of contrast. You're taking 2 different things and putting them next to each other to show the similarities between the 2. This can also be a great technique to take your audience from one place to another or through time in a creative way that doesn't just have a title card thrown over it. So going back to 2001: Space Odyssey with the bone being thrown up in the air and then cutting to the spaceship, you could definitely argue that this cut is a parallel instead of a contrast, taking 2 different tools, one very early on in man's existence and one much later in the future. You could also note that they're very similar in shape and size, so I think it's interesting that you can look at it from 2 different ways. Another pretty famous example is in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, when the treasure hunter puts the hat on young Indy, and then we cut forward to him years later as the more Harrison Fordy version of Indiana Jones that we know.
Get off my plane.
Not only is this a great way of taking us forward in time and in the story, it's also a really nice way to show us a comparison between who he was and who he is and how similar they are. So now we jump over to Interstellar, and one of my favorite sequences in the film, when Cooper is driving away from his family farm, we see different shots mounted on the vehicle and of him as he drives off, and then we cut forward as the countdown ends to the rockets igniting and him beginning to take off. And it really just drives home that idea that he's going on this adventure and that he is in control of those decisions that he made to leave his family. And you know, he's like a pilot and driving, so you know, similarities. I'll give another example of parallelism in Interstellar, also one of my favorite scenes in the film, which is when Cooper is sitting watching his now grown-up daughter sending a video recording to him. As her video recording ends, we then cut to her ending the recording. Not only is this a great transition from one scene and one character to another, but it really highlights the similarities of the journeys that the two characters are taking. Next up, we have symbolism, that is taking two somewhat seemingly unrelated shots and putting them side by side to really show the similarities between the two. Very similar to parallelism, but this is a lot more symbolic, hence the name, symbolism. Definitely the most famous example of this, and probably one of the most famous film edits in history, would be the match cut in Lawrence of Arabia. In the scene leading up to this cut, we have Lawrence talking to another officer about wanting to go to the desert, and the officer telling him about how hot and formidable the desert is, to him then blowing out a match, and then we're suddenly transported to the desert. Now we jump over to Interstellar, and what's actually a very, very similar scenario and edit. We have a scene between Cooper and Romley as Romley expresses his anxiety about the fact that there's very little keeping them from certain death. Cooper then tells him about how many of the best yachtsmen don't actually know how to swim, and then he hands him a recording of sounds of Earth. As these sounds are playing, we then have a cut of them floating through space past Saturn. This does a great job of really underscoring his fears and taking those and putting them on the audience as well. Next up, we have simultaneity. This is probably the easiest one to spot and definitely a favorite of Hollywood action films. When you take two scenes that are going on at the same time and you cut back and forth between the two. When you're intercutting those scenes, it's a great way to keep up the pacing and build up tension. When you get to a point where there's really nothing going on in one scene, you jump over to another scene, play that one out, jump back and forth until either they meet up or they both meet their conclusions. Terrific example of this is in Silence of the Lambs. As the SWAT team is preparing to close in on Buffalo Bill's house, we then cut over to Buffalo Bill, back and forth, as we think that we're leading up to the SWAT team busting in on him, and then it's all revealed that that's actually not the case, and that Clarice is showing up to his house and that they're at the wrong place. This is not just great for building up tension in that scene, but then it completely sets up the tension for what's to come because it's still not resolved. Moving back to Interstellar now, we have a scene where Mann and Cooper are fighting on that awesome ice planet, intercut with the scene where Murph is trying to get her brother and his family out of that house. The tension builds between the two arguments and fighting. Now we move on to leitmotif, which is usually a term for music. It is a repetition of theme. A very famous example is the point of view shot in Jaws. Every time you see that shot, you know exactly what's coming next. Now moving over to Interstellar, there was one really interesting shot and theme that really kept reappearing, and that was camera shots mounted on vehicles. We see a shot of that in the truck, and definitely plenty of shots of that on the smaller Ranger spacecraft. And every time we see that, we know that we're heading into an adventure and danger and the unknown. One of the things I think is really cool about understanding these principles is that they don't just inform you as an editor, they inform you in just about every other capacity of filmmaking. As a writer or director, it's important to know these because it really helps you elevate just telling facts to your audience and finding more clever ways to really relate ideas and emotions and transferring people from place to place. As a cinematographer too, it's really great for establishing themes and from taking people from one shot to the next and conveying a lot of emotion without any dialogue. That's where we're gonna leave things today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like this video, definitely drop it a like, maybe subscribe if you feel compelled to do so. And of course, I would love to hear your thoughts and other examples of each one of these in different films down in the comments below. I'm Colin, and I'll see you guys next week.